When Caroline Leavitt stepped into the Fox News studio shortly after the death of Pope Francis, the audience expected a sharp political interview from the White House press secretary, but the atmosphere quickly turned tense. Leavitt, always composed, in the face of pressure, was unusually stiff. It wasn't just the Pope's death that hung heavy in the air. It was what she had brought with her. A document marked classified in bold red letters. Host Tucker Carlson welcomed her, sensing this wasn't going to be a routine segment. "Madam Secretary, we appreciate your time. Given the state of the world, I imagine your office is overwhelmed." Leavitt responded with a slight nod. "That's an understatement." Tucker didn't press immediately. Instead, he circled the topic, touching on the international reactions to the Pope's passing. But the audience noticed Leavitt wasn't here just for condolences. She was focused on something that seemed far more pressing than even a papal death. As the segment moved forward, Tucker finally leaned in. "You came here tonight with a purpose, something you didn't want to say at the White House podium?" Leavitt looked off camera, nodded slightly, then said, "Yes, what I'm about to say hasn't been cleared by the administration, but I believe the public needs to know." A moment passed. Tucker, a veteran of many interviews, let the silence linger. Leavitt opened the folder, revealing several typed pages and a small envelope with a red seal. She didn't lift the envelope. Instead, she began reading. "These are the final communiques between Pope Francis and leaders in the U.S. intelligence community, dated 3 days before his death." Tucker leaned back, confused. "Are you suggesting the Pope was communicating directly with U.S. intelligence?" Leavitt confirmed. "Yes, and it wasn't ceremonial. It was urgent. He believed something dangerous was unfolding, not just in Rome, but worldwide." The audience in the studio was silent. Viewers at home were flooding social media. Leavitt continued. "The Pope raised concerns about a growing alignment between authoritarian regimes. He feared a coordinated move that could reshape global order, but most importantly, he said the Vatican had intercepted intelligence suggesting a planned destabilization campaign targeting Western democracies, starting with a misinformation wave. A very specific one." Tucker interrupted. "This sounds like something out of a thriller. Do you have proof this came from the Pope himself?" Leavitt held up the sealed envelope. "This was delivered to our embassy in Vatican City, stamped and signed by the Pope's personal secretary." The camera zoomed in. The seal was unmistakable. Leavitt continued. "This envelope contains handwritten notes from the Pope himself. Notes outlining the key operatives, suspected governments involved, and even media organizations believed to be unknowingly helping amplify the misinformation." Tucker paused, then asked, "Is Fox on that list?" Leavitt didn't answer directly. "There are names I cannot say on air without jeopardizing national security. But yes, some major networks are implicated, not knowingly, but through manipulation." Tucker shifted in his seat. This was turning dangerous even for Fox. "Why now?" he asked. "Why reveal this now? And why here?" Leavitt took a breath. "Because the response from within our government has been fractured. Some officials don't believe the documents are legitimate. Others do, but they fear the political fallout. I believe the people deserve to decide for themselves." The rest of the interview was spent unpacking just the surface of the information. No full names were revealed. No nations were explicitly named. But it was clear Leavitt had come to issue a warning, not spin a narrative. By the end of the show, every major outlet had picked up the interview. The clip went viral. The White House refused to comment. The Vatican, through a brief statement, confirmed that the Pope had maintained communications with several global leaders shortly before his death, but refused to elaborate. For days, the public was gripped by the mystery. Then, 3 days later, Caroline Leavitt resigned. Caroline Leavitt's resignation sent waves through Washington. The official reason cited personal concerns, but no one believed that explanation. Not after the Fox News interview. Not after she revealed secret documents allegedly tied to Pope Francis and global intelligence agencies. Journalists gathered outside her home in Georgetown, cameras pointed, waiting for any word, but Leavitt didn't speak. She remained silent, allowing the tension to build on its own. Within hours, Speculation began to take shape. Analysts debated the legitimacy of the envelope she presented. Former CIA officials were called in by major networks to weigh in. Some said the Vatican had a long history of private diplomacy, and that such documents weren't impossible. Others doubted a sitting pope would ever deliver such direct accusations without protocol. What they couldn't argue with was the seal on the envelope. It was authentic. Vatican press officials confirmed its legitimacy, but refused to release further details. The public wanted more, and quietly, some did more than just talk. A group of bipartisan senators, led by an unlikely duo of Democrat Julian Harris and Republican Mark Easton, announced a closed-door session to investigate the contents of the envelope and the surrounding circumstances. The media, sensing a deepening story, began connecting dots. Was the Pope warning the world? Had someone tried to silence him? In the background, whispers about the Pope's death became louder. Officially, it had been reported as heart failure, but critics now suggested the timing was suspicious. He had been scheduled to deliver a private address to European ambassadors 2 days after his death, an address now rumored to contain parts of the same intelligence referenced in the envelope. Meanwhile, Leavitt was being watched, not just by reporters. According to leaked security briefings, she was under unofficial surveillance, not house arrest, but constant monitoring. Despite having resigned, she held several debriefing sessions with intelligence officials. Reports stated she remained firm. The documents were real, the threat was ongoing, and the administration was dragging its feet. Then came another twist. An anonymous whistleblower from within the State Department leaked a memo, dated 4 weeks before the Pope's death, mentioning increased signal traffic between embassies in Vatican City, Moscow, and Tehran. It didn't offer conclusions, but it matched Leavitt's timeline. The media pounced. That night, CNN hosted a special panel featuring 3 former national security advisors, 2 foreign policy experts, and an ex-Vatican liaison. The consensus wasn't definitive, but all agreed. Something unusual had happened in the final days of the Pope's life. Then, Caroline Leavitt broke her silence, not with a statement, not with a press conference, but through a pre-recorded interview with Julian Harris, the same senator who had called for the investigation. In the video, she appeared calm, more at ease than during the Fox interview. "I didn't resign because I was wrong," she said. "I resigned because I was told not to speak, and I won't be part of something that keeps people in the dark." Harris asked, "Are you saying you were threatened?" She paused. Not in those words, but it was made clear that speaking further would be a mistake. The clip aired during prime time. Millions watched. Public pressure grew. More members of Congress called for transparency. Editorial boards from major newspapers demanded the White House declassify related materials. The administration responded cautiously. The president's press secretary issued a short statement saying, "We are reviewing all related intelligence. The safety and trust of the public remain our top priorities." But that wasn't enough. Leaks continued. An internal email surfaced from a U.S. ambassador stationed in Italy, referring to heightened concerns from Vatican sources and intercepted communiques. Meanwhile, the envelope Leavitt revealed was now in secure custody. Julian Harris confirmed that the Senate Intelligence Committee had examined the contents and that initial forensic analysis confirmed the Pope's handwriting. Still, no names were released. No nations were blamed, but public curiosity turned into suspicion. Online forums lit up with theories. Some pointed to recent cyber attacks in Western Europe as signs of coordinated misinformation campaigns. Others noted strange patterns in state-run media from foreign powers. And then, another document emerged. This time from the German intelligence agency, BND, leaked to Der Spiegel. It was a memo dated 2 months before the Pope's death. The memo referenced direct Vatican communication warning of destabilization plots targeting Western unity, and specifically mentioned the United States as the initial testing ground. That phrase echoed what Leavitt had said. The situation had grown beyond Washington. European leaders were now calling for joint investigations. NATO intelligence groups were brought into the fold, and yet, through it all, no one publicly accused any nation. Everyone tiptoed. The implications were too great. The Vatican remained mostly silent, but late one evening they issued a brief statement. "We grieve the passing of the Holy Father. We are aware of the many questions now raised. Let us remind the world that truth, though sometimes delayed, always reveals itself." The message was interpreted in many ways, but one thing was certain. This story was no longer a theory. It was a global crisis waiting to unfold. As questions mounted, pressure grew on world leaders to act. Public demand for clarity had crossed borders. European parliaments scheduled emergency intelligence briefings. In Canada and Australia, lawmakers pushed for access to any Vatican-related communications their embassies might have stored. In the United States, the situation became increasingly political. Opposing parties argued not just about the contents of the documents, but about the administration's response. Some claimed the president was being cautious. Others accused the White House of stalling. The president, in his first extended comment on the matter, addressed the nation during a primetime broadcast. He stood at the podium, hands folded, eyes steady. "My fellow Americans," he began, "recent developments have challenged our understanding of global diplomacy, and they have shaken public trust. I want to speak clearly tonight. We are reviewing every relevant document, every report, every message. The death of Pope Francis was a moment of great sorrow. It must not become a political game." He paused, then continued. "We have received verified communications from our allies, from the Vatican, and from our own agencies. We are coordinating with partners across the globe. We will pursue the truth, fully and responsibly." Though the speech calmed some viewers, others remained skeptical. Social media users noted that he hadn't confirmed or denied the authenticity of the envelope's contents. Meanwhile, Senator Julian Harris's committee worked quietly. Their access to confidential material gave them a clearer picture than the public. Sources close to the committee said the evidence included not just the Pope's notes, but detailed cross-references from intelligence intercepted weeks before his death. What the Pope had feared, insiders claimed, wasn't a physical attack, it was informational. A slow erosion of trust, built through carefully timed falsehoods, aimed at pitting democracies against themselves. Then, for the first time since the envelope was revealed, a name leaked. Not a country, but a figure, Anton Volkov. Volkov, a former Kremlin advisor and current head of a global media consortium, was reportedly mentioned in the Pope's handwritten notes as a coordinator of influence. Within hours, Volkov released a statement from his office in Belgrade. He dismissed the claims as Western fantasy, calling them a pathetic attempt to shift blame for their own internal chaos. But journalists dug deeper. They found that Volkov had been in Rome just a week before the Pope's death. His visit hadn't been reported in official Vatican schedules, yet records showed his private jet landed at Ciampino Airport, and hotel logs placed him near Vatican territory. Theories multiplied. Had the Pope met with Volkov? Had he issued a warning? Or had he learned something during that week that made him compile the notes later sent to Washington? Under mounting international interest, the Vatican announced that it would hold a special press briefing. Speculation ran high. Some hoped the Church would verify the notes. Others feared the Vatican would dismiss the entire issue to avoid political entanglement. At the briefing, Cardinal Giuseppe Morelli, a senior member of the Vatican's diplomatic corps, addressed the world. The Holy Father often communicated with global leaders. His concerns for global peace, justice, and stability were real. We confirm that private messages were sent to several governments, including the United States. However, we do not confirm the full contents or intentions now being speculated upon. When asked directly about the envelope and the Pope's notes, Morelli replied, "The seal is genuine. The handwriting is the Holy Father's. The concerns he raised were sincere, but interpretation must be left to context, not speculation." This statement fueled more debate. Yes, the notes were real. Yes, they were sent. But what did they truly mean? Was the Pope offering intelligence or simply expressing fear? Caroline Leavitt released a follow-up letter through her lawyer. It reiterated her belief that the Pope's warnings were meant to be urgent, actionable alerts. not just philosophical reflections. As this played out, new reports emerged. British intelligence sources leaked that their monitoring systems had flagged unusual online activity, coordinated content drops across different regions, all aiming to discredit Western institutions. Some of these posts had originated from Volkov's media platforms. Others were traced to anonymous accounts linked through proxy servers in Belarus, Iran, and parts of Eastern Europe. The digital trail seemed to support Leavitt's original claim that media manipulation was at the heart of the threat. Yet the public remained divided. Some saw a complex conspiracy. Others saw opportunists turning tragedy into spectacle. Senator Harris, in a joint session with foreign affairs leaders, summarized the state of things best. We are facing not just a geopolitical challenge, but a crisis of perception. The Pope, in his final days, wanted us to see something. We must decide whether to look away or investigate fully, even if it makes us uncomfortable. This was no longer a matter of one woman's resignation or one envelope. It was a global moment, one that demanded truth but moved through shadows. And still, the full contents of the Pope's notes remained sealed from the public eye. As international focus deepened, more governments acknowledged receiving communication from the Vatican prior to Pope Francis's death. France, Spain, and Argentina issued cautious statements confirming contact from the Holy See, without revealing details. Each emphasized the confidentiality of diplomatic messages, yet their acknowledgments added weight to the Vatican's involvement in the emerging crisis. In Washington, the Senate Intelligence Committee worked quietly but persistently. Behind closed doors, they interviewed cybersecurity experts, State Department officials, and members of the president's inner circle. Reports suggested Caroline Leavitt had provided additional documentation, unreleased messages, handwritten annotations, and a digital archive of flagged content shared with her before she left the White House. Though none of this was publicly confirmed, members of Congress grew increasingly vocal. Bipartisan voices began pushing for a limited release of the documents under controlled conditions. Public pressure for answers had reached a new high. Meanwhile, the name Anton Volkov remained at the center of discussions. Investigative journalists revealed that several of his affiliated platforms had recently expanded into language-specific news outlets across Europe and North America. These outlets, while appearing neutral, had published numerous editorials critical of Western governments, democratic institutions, and religious figures. Some stories contained subtle factual inaccuracies later corrected silently, hallmarks of narrative manipulation. Digital watchdog groups presented data showing synchronized posting behavior across these outlets. Analysts explained how narratives were planted and recycled through a loop, seeded on obscure blogs, picked up by affiliated outlets, and then referenced by larger platforms, giving false stories an appearance of legitimacy. Back in Rome, the Vatican maintained a careful stance. Cardinal Morelli, in a second briefing, emphasized that the Church remained committed to peace and dialogue. He neither supported nor denied claims of external manipulation, but urged the world to pursue truth with humility and patience. That same week, a newly formed EU security consortium released a report highlighting increased disinformation campaigns traced to Eastern Europe and the Caucasus region. While it didn't name specific individuals, its findings aligned with prior U.S. briefings and pointed to private networks with cross-border influence operations. The global narrative was shifting. What began as an unusual resignation now resembled a coordinated effort to weaken trust across nations. Still, the U.S. administration treaded carefully. Officials insisted they were gathering evidence before drawing conclusions. The president declined further comments, leaving public briefings to his press team. In a surprising development, the former Italian ambassador to the Vatican, Giovanni De Lucci, gave an interview to a major newspaper. He revealed that Pope Francis had expressed deep concern during a private dinner just 2 months before his death. According to De Lucci, the Pope spoke of a rising tide of doubt, saying that falsehoods were being woven into belief systems and weaponized as truth. Though De Lucci declined to elaborate, his remarks matched the philosophical tone of the Pope's previous homilies. Yet in the context of current events, they gained new meaning. Then came the leak no one expected. And B. Internal transcript of an early Vatican meeting, held 2 weeks before the Pope's death, was anonymously published online. It included discussions about hostile media ecosystems, external pressure on clergy, and unverified information seeking to provoke moral division. While the Vatican declined to verify the document, former church officials admitted the language used was consistent with such meetings. Global reactions grew more intense. Protesters gathered outside consulates in several cities, demanding transparency. Social media was flooded with calls for a global summit on digital truth and foreign influence. In response, the United Nations announced a session to address information integrity and global trust. Delegates from over 70 nations confirmed attendance. The U.S. sent its Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs, while the Vatican dispatched Cardinal Morelli as its official representative. The summit's agenda included proposals for international cooperation on countering misinformation, ethical standards for news platforms, and diplomatic protocols for intelligence sharing during times of global concern. But even as the summit approached, tensions escalated. Cyber attacks hit government websites in Germany, the Netherlands, and Canada. Though no group claimed responsibility, initial forensic reports suggested coordination. Analysts believed the attacks were designed not to disable, but to provoke fear and confusion. Simultaneously, more data analysts came forward. One group, operating independently, released a report that identified bot clusters originating in unregistered networks, primarily used to amplify anti-democratic sentiment. Many of these clusters were linked to Volkov-associated domains. Facing this mounting evidence, a few members of Congress broke ranks. Representative Alicia Monroe, a moderate Democrat, called for a full public release of the Pope's letters and any related intelligence, stating, "People cannot make sound judgments if kept in the dark. Transparency is now a necessity, not a luxury." Other lawmakers joined her. Political differences gave way to broader concern. The issue had grown beyond party lines. It was now about stability, democracy, and the credibility of leadership. Yet still, Caroline Leavitt remained largely quiet. Her interview with Senator Harris remained her last public appearance. She declined further media invitations. Her lawyer issued only one additional statement. Ms. Leavitt believes the truth is moving forward on its own now. She has no further comment. The silence in many ways said more than words. The United Nations summit opened under heavy security. As world leaders filed into the Assembly Hall in Geneva, reporters noted a rare sense of unity. Nations often divided by policy or history were now seated side by side, sharing unease about an unseen force that seemed to shape public perception more than any speech or law. Cardinal Morelli opened with a brief, solemn address. Pope Francis believed in the power of dialogue, he said, but he also believed that dialogue requires truth. When truth is fractured, dialogue breaks. Our task here is not to repair history, but to defend our future. The speech received a standing ovation, even from delegates who had remained cautious toward the Vatican's role in recent events. The U.S. representative, Undersecretary Miguel Devlin, followed with a stark summary of the situation. "We have observed the weaponization of doubt," he said. "Not through armies, but through algorithms. Not through invasions, but through narratives. The effect is similar. Trust erodes, communities fracture, and democracy weakens." His speech included a veiled reference to Anton Volkov, though he did not name him directly. "We must not pretend that influence is accidental when its patterns are global and synchronized," he said. Behind the scenes, side meetings took place. Representatives from allied nations compared intelligence. Cybersecurity officials shared tracking methods. Legal advisors drafted language for new treaties that would require transparency from digital platforms operating across borders. Though progress was slow, the tone was clear. The world was finally treating disinformation as a global threat. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the Senate Intelligence Committee had begun drafting its preliminary report. Leaks to the press indicated that the report would confirm the authenticity of the Pope's letter, and acknowledged that the intelligence contained within was consistent with current findings from several allied agencies. This represented a major shift. Until now, the White House had resisted confirming any single document, but the committee's bipartisan support signaled that political hesitations were giving way to urgency. Public interest surged again. Media outlets prepared special segments. Opinion pieces debated whether the Pope's letter was a warning that went unheard, or a blueprint the world was only now beginning to understand. At the same time, Anton Volkov escalated his counter-narrative. Appearing in a rare televised interview, he called the entire investigation a paranoid fantasy orchestrated by declining powers clinging to influence. He accused the Vatican of falling under Anglo-American manipulation and warned that what they fear is not misinformation, it's voices they cannot control. Though his interview was broadcast on several of his affiliated platforms, mainstream media largely avoided it. Still, clips circulated widely online, amplified by networks of anonymous accounts, many of them linked back to the same bot clusters previously identified by analysts. It became clear that while world governments were moving toward coordinated action, the information war was still ongoing. In a private interview with an investigative journalist, a former cybersecurity officer described the situation bluntly. "This isn't a leak or a scandal," he said. "It's a new kind of battlefield." The Pope understood that. He saw how fear and falsehood could be spread in a way no firewall could block. That sentiment echoed in the halls of the United Nations as delegates debated resolutions. A draft resolution circulated that would create an international oversight group, a neutral body, to investigate coordinated misinformation and issue warnings across borders. Some feared it would infringe on speech. Others argued it was overdue. Meanwhile, Senator Julian Harris returned to the public spotlight with an address on the Senate floor. "We cannot be afraid of what we learn. We cannot protect democracy by shielding it from truth. If manipulation exists, we must name it. If trust is broken, we must repair it. But silence helps only those who benefit from confusion." His speech was carried live on multiple networks. Polls taken afterward showed a noticeable shift in public opinion. More Americans now supported full declassification of the Pope's communication. Yet amid all this, a different kind of story emerged. A small parish in Argentina released excerpts from the Pope's final homily, delivered just 3 days before his passing. The text had never been shared outside the local community. In it, the Pope had said, "A shepherd's duty is not only to comfort, but to call. When storms gather and flocks wander, we must speak, not to accuse, but to awaken." These words spread quickly, quoted on news programs and shared across social media. They were seen by some as a quiet confirmation that the Pope had been aware of the storm now gripping global politics and had tried to leave a moral trail behind. At the Vatican, Cardinal Morelli issued one final statement before returning to Rome. "The Holy Father left no enemies in death," he said, "but perhaps he left questions. Questions we must now answer, not with suspicion but with courage." Even critics found the message difficult to ignore. Across capitals and on screens, the conversation was no longer about one document or one resignation. It had become a reckoning with the era itself, an age where information had no borders and where truth, once lost, was not easily restored. As public attention deepened and diplomatic meetings expanded, one theme began to emerge clearly. The world was no longer simply reacting to the Pope's death. It was recalibrating its entire approach to truth, leadership, and influence. Washington, the Senate Intelligence Committee released a redacted version of its preliminary findings. The report confirmed that Pope Francis had indeed authored the letter in question, and that its contents aligned with verified intelligence, gathered independently by U.S. and European agencies. Though heavily censored, the report emphasized 3 key points: the rising threat of coordinated digital influence campaigns, the complicity of non-state actors with access to global platforms, and the Vatican's prescient warning long before public awareness caught up. The White House, for the first time, acknowledged the letter directly. In a brief statement, the press secretary said, "The Pope's communication represents an early recognition of what our institutions are now beginning to confront: His insight serves as a reminder of how leadership sometimes sees what others miss. This admission marked a shift. For months, the administration had remained non-committal. Now, with bipartisan support and international consensus forming, it no longer made sense to deflect. Meanwhile, new details about Anton Volkov's operations surfaced. A leaked dossier compiled by an allied intelligence agency revealed that Volkov's media networks had operated with military-grade strategy. The dossier described how topics were chosen based on geopolitical events, how emotional triggers were tested across demographics, and how content was often adjusted in real time based on reaction data. More disturbingly, the report suggested that Volkov had maintained informal ties with rogue digital operatives across 3 continents. Though not illegal in every jurisdiction, these partnerships allowed him to expand quickly, test narratives in low-visibility regions, and build echo chambers insulated from scrutiny. Analysts described this method as influence laundering. It operated much like financial laundering. A falsehood would begin on a fringe blog, get picked up by a foreign outlet, translated into mainstream language, and then cited as a growing viewpoint. By the time it reached the public in major democracies, it appeared organic, even popular. Lawmakers began referencing this pattern directly. Senator Alicia Monroe introduced a bill proposing transparency requirements for news outlets receiving funding or editorial input from foreign entities. "No one's censoring speech," she said during debate. "We're simply labeling the source. In a democracy, the speaker matters." Across the Atlantic, similar conversations unfolded. The European Union voted to begin drafting legislation requiring disclosure of algorithmic biases in platforms distributing news. France and Germany backed the motion, emphasizing that while free speech remained protected, manipulation through opacity was not. At the Vatican, Cardinal Morelli convened an internal synod with bishops from 5 continents. Though the details were not made public, sources close to the meeting said it focused on how the Church should navigate a world in which truth was no longer universally understood in the same way. One source described the discussion as not about doctrine but about dialogue. In the United States, public opinion continued to shift. Trust in traditional media slightly increased, while unverified online sources saw a decline in engagement for the first time in over a year. Educational institutions began proposing media literacy curriculum updates, urging younger generations to learn how to recognize influence techniques and source origins. Meanwhile, Caroline Leavitt broke her silence. In a carefully crafted statement, released through her attorney, she addressed the unfolding events without naming any specific individuals. "When I chose to speak out, I did so because I believed the public deserved to know the risks that had been quietly growing beneath the surface of political discourse. I never expected that act to reshape a global conversation. But if it leads us toward clarity, then it was worth it." The statement was shared widely, and even former critics acknowledged its measured tone. Analysts debated whether Leavitt had been a whistleblower, an insider, or simply someone in the right place at the right time. Regardless, her role was now historical. Shortly after, news emerged that Pope Francis's private archive included several other letters written to world leaders and influential thinkers. The Vatican did not confirm the contents but admitted their existence, promising a thorough and appropriate review process before any release. That revelation reignited speculation. Who else had the Pope warned? And why had no one spoken of it sooner? As questions multiplied, so did action. The UN resolution to create an International Council on Information Integrity passed with a 2/3 majority. While non-binding, it set the groundwork for future cooperation. Several nations volunteered to host the Council's pilot program, including Canada, Sweden, and South Korea. In educational circles, universities began forming joint programs on digital ethics combining political science, computer science, and philosophy. Professors described it as teaching future leaders how to think about the invisible architecture of society. Even tech companies responded. A major platform announced it would begin testing features that let users trace the origin of viral posts, an effort to give context without removing content. These were not revolutionary changes, But they signaled a collective recognition that something fundamental had shifted. And yet, amid the new awareness, the deeper lesson lingered, one that Pope Francis had perhaps seen more clearly than most. That in a time when trust could be so easily manufactured or destroyed, the responsibility to preserve it rested not in governments alone, but in every institution, every voice, every citizen. As institutions moved into new territory, the pace of response began to outstrip the pace of misinformation for the first time. Though imperfect and occasionally slow, the machinery of global governance was beginning to show signs of adaptation. In Geneva, the pilot initiative for the International Council on Information Integrity began its first internal assessments. Composed of representatives from over 20 countries, the council included experts in data ethics, journalism, artificial intelligence, and international law. Its purpose was not to regulate speech, but to identify and expose coordinated influence, efforts that crossed borders under the guise of independent expression. "We are not a censorship body," said the council's chair in the opening session. "Our job is to make the invisible visible. When narratives move in perfect sync across fake accounts, and when bots outnumber real people, that's not speech. It's strategy." Initial reports focused on pattern recognition, when identical talking points appeared within seconds on different platforms, when certain key phrases showed up in multiple languages, when anonymous accounts appeared to mimic the behavior of real users, but lacked any verifiable identity. The findings supported what intelligence analysts had claimed for years, that some of the world's most divisive conversations were not entirely organic, but engineered to seem that way. Back in the United States, Senator Harris introduced a resolution urging digital platforms to voluntarily participate in the council's efforts. "We have long believed that free speech must be protected," he said. "But we also must protect the environment in which that speech occurs. If the public square is poisoned, then all voices suffer, especially the truthful ones." Several major platforms responded cautiously but positively. One agreed to share anonymized metadata on suspected bot networks. Another committed to labeling posts shared by accounts tied to foreign state entities. A third launched a transparency dashboard, allowing users to see where a post originated and how it spread. Though these steps were limited, they marked the beginning of cooperation between governments and tech companies that had long resisted oversight. Meanwhile, the media refocused on a critical piece of the story: the Pope's other letters. A source close to the Vatican confirmed that among the unreleased communications were messages addressed to leaders in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. These were not warnings about specific individuals, but rather reflections on the global fragility of truth and the moral responsibilities of leadership in a digital era. One letter, sent to a prominent South American president, reportedly stated, "Power today does not reside in armies or ballots alone, but in the ability to shape perception. If perception is shaped by fear, then the soul of a nation becomes captive." These words, once private, now formed the philosophical spine of a growing movement. Public intellectuals, journalists, and educators began to frame the current moment, not as a political scandal, but as a turning point in the relationship between democracy and information. Articles and books were rushed to press, exploring how societies had failed to foresee the vulnerabilities that had been exploited, not just by bad actors, but by systemic neglect. In classrooms, students studied case examples of digital manipulation. In parliaments, bills were debated that balanced rights with responsibilities. In homes, families discussed how to verify what they read and how to disagree without division. At the same time, Anton Volkov's influence began to wane. Though his network still operated, public trust in its content had declined significantly. Independent fact-checkers flagged several major stories as coordinated misinformation. Former insiders from his media group came forward, confirming the use of automation, planted narratives, and simulated engagement. The revelations eroded his credibility, though not entirely. A loyal audience remained, and some defenders framed the backlash as proof of persecution. But for the first time, Volkov was no longer setting the terms of the debate. He was responding to it. As the Vatican prepared to release the remaining letters in a controlled archive, Cardinal Morelli addressed the public one final time. "The Church does not hold the answers to every question," he said, "but it has always tried to ask the right ones. These letters are not accusations. They are reflections. Let them be studied with the humility they were written in." His words resonated. Historians viewed the moment as part of a broader legacy, one where religious, political, and civic leaders came together to face a challenge that no nation or faith could tackle alone. On the ground, small but symbolic actions took place. In a school in northern Italy, students created a digital trust journal, tracking stories across platforms and identifying which ones had credible sources. In Nigeria, a youth organization began training volunteers in media analysis and platform accountability. In Canada, a public radio network launched a series called Signal and Noise, designed to teach audiences how to separate facts from influence. And, in Rome near the Vatican, a modest exhibit opened in a quiet museum. It displayed the handwritten letter of Pope Francis, preserved under glass, its text translated into dozens of languages, each copy titled simply, "To Those Who Must Listen." The exhibit drew long lines, not for spectacle, but for reflection. People, read slowly. They spoke in hushed tones. They came not to witness a moment of political controversy, but to understand how, in his final days, a global leader had seen something in the noise that others had missed. As the exhibit in Rome continued to draw attention, it became clear that the story of the Pope's letter had transformed from a single document into a lasting symbol. It was no longer just about what was written, but about what had been heard, and what had been ignored for too long. The impact reverberated across institutions. Universities incorporated the letter into ethics curricula, analyzing not just its content but its timing, its tone, and its understated urgency. In diplomacy, it was cited in discussions not as a religious text, but as an early diagnostic of the world's most modern dilemma, the erosion of shared reality. Journalists debated how to balance speed with accuracy. Editors questioned how headlines shaped public belief. Broadcasters reconsidered their platform's role in amplifying not just stories, but emotions. In many ways, the Pope's death had not ended a chapter. It had begun a reckoning. The Vatican, after extensive review, released select portions of additional letters choosing transparency over containment. One addressed to an international humanitarian organization highlighted the risk of truth being politicized. When facts are first filtered through allegiance, the Pope had written, they arrive corrupted, no matter their accuracy. Another message sent to an unnamed tech executive included a warning. The architecture you build may serve the world or fragment it. Your designs are not neutral. Your choices echo across generations. These messages struck a chord across industries. The idea that influence could be both invisible and intentional began to reshape policy conversations. The question was no longer whether manipulation existed. It was how societies would respond once they recognized it. Legislators in several countries moved to establish ethical oversight boards for digital platforms. These were not regulatory bodies, but advisory panels designed to guide platforms in transparency and accountability. The goal was not to control speech, but to illuminate its context. At the same time, misinformation networks responded. Accusations of censorship escalated. Narratives emerged claiming the Pope's letters were fabricated or misinterpreted. A small but vocal segment of the public insisted the controversy was a distraction from more pressing issues. But these efforts, while noisy, lacked momentum. Fact-checkers worked swiftly. Cross-platform collaboration improved. And audiences, newly sensitized, began to ask harder questions before sharing content. In a televised interview, Caroline Leavitt addressed these dynamics directly. No one wants to be manipulated, she said. But the truth is, manipulation often wears the mask of what we already believe. The danger isn't disagreement. It's when we stop asking where our beliefs come from. Her words were replayed widely. They captured the core of what the Pope's letter had surfaced. That truth, while absolute in theory, was now experienced as relative, and that bridging this divide required more than algorithms or policy. It required intent. In the final months of the year, several nations signed a multilateral agreement pledging to adopt standardized transparency practices for digital information. The agreement, symbolic in nature, was a first step toward recognition, coordination, and collective responsibility. Analysts describe the moment as a shift from reaction to architecture. For decades, the digital world had grown without blueprints. Now, leaders were beginning to draft guidelines, not to limit freedom, but to preserve the conditions under which it could thrive. Meanwhile, the Vatican announced that no further letters would be released in the near future. The remaining correspondence, they said, would be preserved in the papal archives, available to future scholars. That announcement quieted speculation, but did not reduce interest. Conferences were scheduled, forums convened, and in public dialogue, the Pope's words continued to resonate. In a surprising move, one major social media company released a white paper outlining proposed internal reforms. Among them were algorithmic transparency, a flagging system for foreign influence indicators, and a commitment to third-party audits. Critics remained cautious, but praised the gesture as a move in the right direction. The global conversation had changed. Not everyone agreed on how to proceed, but few denied the need to proceed at all. As the year closed, a new awareness had settled over public life. Not just that information could be shaped, but that it had always been shaped. The difference now was that more people could see the hands doing the shaping. In churches, sermons spoke of moral courage. In classrooms, students were asked not only what they believed, but why. In newsrooms, fact-checking was no longer a side task, it was central. And in a small Vatican museum, the exhibit remained. Visitors continued to read the letter, its words quiet, almost austere. There was no flashing headline, no urgent command. Just a final reflection from a man whose power came not from what he controlled, but from what he understood. In the end, the Pope's message had not been about a single threat or a single actor. It had been a meditation on the fragility of trust in an age where influence was both currency and weapon. He had written not with alarm, but with clarity, not to incite fear, but to offer direction, not to dictate policy, but to provoke reflection. And perhaps that was why his words endured. Because while systems could be corrupted and platforms could be co-opted, conscience could not be automated. It could only be awakened. And now, awakened it was.